Joe placed the plates on the table with a tired smile, breathing in the scent of fresh basil and rosemary that filled the kitchen air. His wife, Linda, was carefully chopping tomatoes while the lights of New Orleans, their home for the past few years, flickered through the window. This city had become their haven, a place to unwind after a long day. "You won't believe what I was thinking, Joe," Linda said, breaking her concentration. She always spoke to him calmly, but tonight there was something unusual in her tone. Joe looked at her, raising an eyebrow with interest. "All right, tell me. What is it this time?" Linda smiled, but it looked slightly tense. "I was thinking of inviting my new boss over for dinner. You know Eric Norton, right?" The name sounded familiar. "The new boss from your company." Linda nodded, and her knife paused above the cutting board for a moment. "Yes, he wants to meet our family, you know. Once he mentioned he was curious to know more about our values and how we live. What do you think?" Joe thought about it, glancing around at the familiar coziness of their apartment and inhaling the smells of dinner. He knew Linda had talked about her new boss a few times. Eric, by her description, was hardworking and charismatic, but he had an odd reputation at the office. Linda had mentioned how he observed each employee closely and seemed overly interested in their personal lives. Joe chewed his lip, hesitating. He wasn't particularly keen on inviting strangers into his home, but he was willing to make an exception for Linda. "Sure," Joe said, shrugging. "Let's invite him." "When were you thinking?" "How about tomorrow?" she suggested, a sincere, slightly excited smile appearing on her face. She'd always believed that support from her boss would help her career, and Joe could see how much it meant to her. "Tomorrow it is," he agreed, pushing away his doubts. He'd leave work a bit early and pick up something special for dinner. The next day, Joe felt as though his busy day flew by faster than expected. By evening, he'd left work early as promised, with a bouquet of wildflowers for Linda. She loved little surprises. In the parking lot, he noticed a car that undoubtedly belonged to their guest, a brand new, gleaming black Tesla. "Looks like he's already here," Joe thought, holding the flowers as he walked toward the house. Linda, as always, greeted him with a radiant smile. She took the flowers and, brushing her lips against his cheek, whispered, "You always know how to lift my mood." "I want tonight to be special," Joe replied, smiling. He loved making her happy and seeing her delighted. "Eric's already in the living room. Go introduce yourself," she said, gesturing to the room. Joe nodded and headed there. Eric, a tall man in a perfectly tailored gray suit, sat on their couch, holding a glass of wine and taking in the room with a calm gaze. His expression was relaxed, but Joe immediately noticed something odd, a slight smirk that never left his face. "Joe, nice to meet you," Eric said, standing up and extending his hand. His handshake was firm, almost too assertive, as if he wanted to establish control immediately. "Thanks for coming," Joe replied, trying to be polite. "I hope you'll feel comfortable here." "Oh, I'm sure I will," Eric said, settling back onto the couch. His tone was as smooth as his expensive suit, yet there was an underlying tension about him. He seemed to look at everything with a hint of irony, as though he already knew something nobody else did. They chatted for a bit, and Joe offered him some whiskey he bought especially for the evening. But there was something about this man that wouldn't let Joe relax. He sensed that the evening wouldn't be as simple as it seemed. When Linda called them to the table, Joe felt a slight easing of the tension. Her dishes were always impeccable, and tonight was no exception. She prepared roasted chicken with herbs, baby potatoes, and crispy green beans. The meal looked as if it could have graced a restaurant table, and Joe was happy to see the pride on his wife's face. They ate in silence until Eric finally broke it, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied smile as he held his wine glass. "Linda, Joe," he began, looking at them with that same strange half-smile. "You have a lovely home. And Joe, your wife is simply amazing." Joe nodded, lightly squeezing Linda's hand, feeling a pang of unease rise in his chest. "Thank you, Eric. I'm very proud of her." Eric nodded, still staring at them, and then said something Joe would never have expected to hear. Then you'll probably understand why I intend to spend the night with your wife." The words hit Joe as though he'd been physically struck. Linda went pale and froze as if she were paralyzed. Joe wanted to say something, but his throat closed up with a mix of anger and shock. Finally, he managed to say, "What kind of sick joke is this, Eric?" Eric only smiled wider, keeping his calm but cold gaze on them. "It's not a joke, Joe. It's a statement. You simply need to know." Joe stood abruptly, hearing his chair scrape against the floor. He glanced at Linda, who seemed unable to speak, her eyes full of confusion and fear. "Go to the kitchen, Linda," Joe said, not taking his eyes off Eric, struggling to keep his rage in check. "I'll handle this." Linda got up, her hands shaking as she left the room, and Joe stepped closer to Eric, wishing his hands weren't trembling so much. He wasn't used to situations like this, and every instinct urged him to throw Eric out of the house. But he realized there was another way. "Eric, let's go to my study. I want to show you something." Eric smirked, but he agreed, calmly following Joe down the hallway. Joe opened the door and when Eric entered, switched on the light. In the room, besides his work documents and laptop, hung a modest collection. Photos from his past, military medals, and several hunting knives he'd collected over the years. "You know, Eric, I'm not just a desk worker. I served in the army. A rifle was my weapon. I know what it means to maintain clear boundaries, and when someone threatens my family, I'm ready to do whatever it takes to protect them." Joe's words seemed to spark a flicker of doubt in Eric. His tanned face paled slightly, and he momentarily looked away. Eric shifted uncomfortably under Joe's steady gaze, though he quickly tried to regain his composure. With a faint smirk, he crossed his arms, leaning casually against the doorway, as if dismissing Joe's subtle threat. "Military background, huh?" Eric said, his tone light but clearly testing. "You must miss that thrill of having control, keeping things in order. In a way, I get it." Joe took a slow, measured breath, keeping his anger in check. He'd learned over the years that confronting people like Eric head-on could be risky. Men who acted with this kind of arrogance usually had hidden motives or defenses. He knew better than to play into Eric's game, especially in his own home. "Yes, it does give you perspective," Joe replied, his voice calm. "And it gives you a clear sense of what's important. Family, for instance." Eric's smirk faded slightly, but he didn't back down. Instead, he changed tactics, moving closer to Joe as he spoke. "I respect that, Joe, truly. In fact, that's why I wanted to get to know you and Linda better. I need people around me who understand loyalty and commitment. That's rare these days." Joe couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. "Loyalty and commitment? You just threatened to sleep with my wife." Eric chuckled softly, as if he were speaking to a friend who didn't quite understand. "Oh, come on, Joe. Don't take everything so seriously. In business and in life, a little tension never hurts. Keeps things interesting." He looked around the room, examining the knives and medals on the wall. "I like your collection," he said, brushing his fingers over one of the medals. "Shows a man with taste." Joe clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. "Eric, I'm not sure what you think this is, but if you cross a line here, there will be consequences." Eric met his gaze again, his eyes narrowing. "You talk a lot about consequences, Joe. But let me tell you something. I don't make idle threats. When I set my sights on something, I make sure it's mine." A thick silence filled the room as they stared each other down. Joe's patience was wearing thin, and he knew it. He wasn't a man who liked being threatened, especially in his own house. "Enough, Eric," Joe finally said, his voice low and firm. "This is my home. If you think you're going to intimidate me, you're wasting your time. Leave now before I make you." Eric's smirk slowly faded, and he seemed to weigh his options. Joe could see the flicker of calculation in his eyes, as if he were testing just how far he could push. But after a few tense moments, he nodded slightly and straightened his suit, taking on a more composed demeanor. "All right, Joe," Eric said with a slight shrug. "I respect your boundaries. No need to make this evening any more eventful." He glanced around the room one last time before heading toward the door. "But just remember, You never know when I might decide to visit again." Joe followed him out of the study, his body tense as he escorted him back to the entryway. He was determined to see Eric leave without a word to Linda, who was waiting anxiously in the kitchen. Eric paused at the door, casting a final, smug look over his shoulder. "Good night, Joe," he said with that unsettling smirk, as if he'd won some unspoken game. "And do give Linda my regards." Without another word, Eric stepped outside, and Joe closed the door firmly behind him. Resisting the urge to lock it, he took a moment to gather himself, letting out a deep breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The sense of relief was short-lived, though. Despite Eric leaving, Joe felt a lingering tension in the air, as if the man's presence had tainted the safety of their home. Joe returned to the kitchen to find Linda waiting, her eyes filled with worry. "Is he gone?" she asked softly. Joe nodded, trying to reassure her. "Yeah, he's gone. I don't think he'll be back anytime soon." Linda looked down, visibly shaken. "I can't believe he'd say something like that. In our home, no less." She hugged her arms around herself, as if she felt a sudden chill. "Do you think he'll keep his word?" Joe placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'll make sure he does. Don't worry, we won't be seeing much of him." But even as he said it, Joe couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. Men like Eric didn't just leave things alone. He sensed that tonight's encounter was only the beginning. The following days passed without incident, and Joe began to think that perhaps Eric had gotten the message. Life returned to its usual pace. Linda went back to work, though she seemed quieter than usual, her mind often elsewhere. Joe kept an eye on things, watching for any sign that Eric might try to interfere in their lives again. It wasn't until the end of the week that Joe received an unexpected call. He was at his office, sorting through paperwork, when his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Linda. Eric just came by my office. He didn't say anything strange, just wanted to discuss some project details. But I thought you should know. Joe felt his pulse quicken as he read the message. He had hoped that Eric would take the hint and stay away, but it seemed that the man wasn't so easily deterred. Joe immediately called Linda. "Did he say anything inappropriate?" he asked, his voice barely hiding the anger. "No," she replied, sounding tense. "He kept it professional, but it felt strange. He looked at me in a way that made me uncomfortable." Joe's grip tightened on his phone. "All right, don't worry. If he steps out of line even once, let me know. I'll handle it." After hanging up, Joe felt a surge of anger coursing through him. He wanted to confront Eric, to make it crystal clear that any further interaction would be unacceptable. But he also knew he had to be cautious. Eric was a powerful man, someone who could make their lives difficult if things went too far. For now, Joe decided to bide his time, waiting to see if Eric would back off. He would give him one more chance, but he wouldn't hesitate to take action if the man crossed the line again. A few more days passed without any further incidents, and Joe began to relax once more, thinking that perhaps Eric had decided to move on. But just as they were starting to settle back into their routine, Linda came home looking visibly shaken one evening. "What happened?" Joe asked, immediately concerned. Linda hesitated before speaking, as if unsure how to explain. He sent me an email today. It was just a simple message about some work thing, but the way he signed it." Joe frowned. "What did he say?" Linda took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "He signed it with, 'Until next time.'" Joe felt a chill run down his spine. The words seemed innocent enough, but he could sense the undertone, the implied threat hidden within them. Eric was taunting them, pushing boundaries in subtle but undeniable ways. "That's it," Joe said, his tone firm. "I'm not letting this go any further. He's testing us, Linda. He's waiting to see if we'll back down. But I won't let him intimidate us like this." Linda nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude and relief. "I trust you, Joe. I know you'll keep us safe." That night, as they prepared for bed, Joe lay awake, his mind racing with thoughts of Eric. He didn't know exactly what he would do, but he was determined to put an end to this once and for all. The following morning, Joe woke with a sense of determination he hadn't felt in a long time. Eric had crossed a line, and Joe knew he had to act. He wasn't about to let this man threaten his family or disrupt their peace. After seeing Linda off to work with a reassuring hug, Joe took the day off. He had a plan, and it began with a visit to Eric's office. By mid-morning, Joe found himself standing in the sleek, glass-walled lobby of the high-rise where Eric's company was located. He straightened his shoulders, walked up to the receptionist, and with a calm but firm tone asked to see Eric Norton. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" she asked politely, glancing at her screen. "No, but he'll want to see me," Joe replied, maintaining eye contact. He knew he was playing a bold hand, but he was past caring about formalities. A few minutes later, after some back and forth, a young assistant appeared to escort Joe up to Eric's floor. He followed her down a brightly lit hallway to Eric's office, a corner suite with a panoramic view of the city. As Joe stepped inside, he found Eric seated behind an expansive desk, his back to the door, gazing out at the skyline. "Joe," Eric said smoothly, turning around with a faint smile. "This is a surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Joe closed the door behind him, trying to keep his voice calm. "I think you know why I'm here, Eric." Eric's smirk grew wider. "I have to admit, I'm intrigued. I didn't think you'd actually come here in person." He leaned back in his chair, looking almost amused. "What can I do for you?" Joe took a step closer, his jaw clenched. "Listen, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but it stops now. You've made your intentions clear, and you've been testing boundaries. I'm here to tell you that whatever you think you're going to do, it ends here." Eric chuckled softly, crossing his arms over his chest. "You think you can just waltz in here and threaten me, Joe? I'll remind you that this is my office and my company. You're the one overstepping here." Joe's fists clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to make it clear that you're not welcome in our lives. Whatever obsession you've developed ends now, or there will be consequences." Eric's expression darkened, his smirk fading. "Consequences? You talk big, Joe, but I don't think you realize who you're dealing with. I can make life very difficult for you, and for Linda." He spoke her name with a slow, deliberate emphasis, watching Joe's reaction closely. Joe felt a surge of anger but kept his tone steady. "If you come near her again, or if I even hear about you reaching out to her in any way, we're going to have a problem." Eric laughed, the sound cold and humorless. "A problem? Joe, I could ruin you both with a single email. I know people, powerful people. You and Linda are nobodies in my world. Don't make the mistake of thinking you can intimidate me." Joe's mind raced. He anticipated arrogance, but not this level of cold calculation. "We may be nobodies to you," Joe replied, "but we're people with lives, and I'll protect my family at any cost. Maybe you should take a look in the mirror, Eric. Maybe it's you who needs to understand that there are limits." Eric's eyes flashed with anger, his calm facade finally cracking. "You think you can come into my office and lecture me about limits?" He stood up, his voice rising. "I could have you blacklisted in every company from here to the coast. You'd be lucky to find work again. So tell me, Joe, who's really in control here?" Joe looked Eric squarely in the eyes, refusing to back down. "I'm done with your threats. This is your final warning. Stay away from my family." Eric leaned closer, his voice now a deadly whisper. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Joe. I don't make idle threats either. Remember that." Without another word, Joe turned and walked out of the office, his heart pounding. He felt a strange mixture of anger and fear, but he knew he'd done the right thing. He couldn't let this man continue his sick game. If Eric didn't back off, Joe would find another way to protect his family, even if it meant going public with what was happening. As he left the building, Joe took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. His mind was racing with possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. He wasn't sure what Eric's next move would be, but he was prepared to do whatever it took to keep his family safe. That evening, Joe arrived home, where Linda was waiting anxiously. She could sense something was wrong the moment he walked through the door. "Joe," she began, "did something happen?" Joe nodded, setting down his keys. "I went to see him. I told him to stay away from us." Linda's eyes widened, her face a mixture of relief and worry. "What did he say?" Joe hesitated, not wanting to worry her any more than necessary. He tried to act like he had the upper hand, but I made it clear that we're not going to stand for his threats. I don't think he'll risk coming around again." Linda reached for Joe's hand, squeezing it tightly. "I'm so glad you did that, but I'm scared, Joe. What if he doesn't stop?" Joe pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "We'll handle it, Linda. Together. No matter what he does, we'll get through it." For the rest of the evening, they tried to enjoy a quiet dinner, but the tension lingered in the air. Linda seemed distracted, her mind clearly dwelling on the encounter. Joe couldn't blame her. The fear that Eric might retaliate in some way gnawed at him too, but he was determined to stay vigilant, ready to defend their peace at any cost. The following week passed without incident, and gradually, Joe and Linda began to relax. It seemed as though Eric had taken the hint, or perhaps he was simply biding his time. Either way, Joe kept a close eye on things, making sure to check in with Linda regularly throughout the day. "Linda," he began gently, "is everything okay? You've seemed different lately." She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "I'm sorry, Joe. I just can't shake this feeling that he's watching us, waiting for a chance to strike." Joe's expression softened as he took her hand. "I understand, but I think he knows we're not backing down. We're not the kind of people he can manipulate so easily." Linda managed a weak smile. "I hope you're right." That night, as they lay in bed, Joe couldn't help but feel a growing unease. He knew Eric's type, men who thrived on power, who refused to accept defeat. He had no doubt that Eric was still out there, watching and waiting for his opportunity. The next day, Joe decided to take matters a step further. He reached out to a friend of his, a retired police officer named Tom, who still had contacts within the department. They met at a nearby coffee shop, where Joe explained the situation in careful detail, leaving out no part of Eric's threats. Tom listened intently, his brow furrowed. "Sounds like a real piece of work," he said after Joe finished. "I can't make any promises, Joe, but I'll look into him. See if there's anything on record. Men like him usually have a past." Joe felt a surge of relief. "Thanks, Tom. I need to know if we're dealing with someone more dangerous than we realize." Tom nodded, his expression serious. "I'll be in touch, but keep an eye on your family. People like him don't take well to being challenged." Joe returned home with a renewed sense of hope. Maybe with Tom's help, he'd finally be able to put an end to this nightmare. A few days passed, and Joe tried to push the encounter with Eric to the back of his mind. He felt he had done everything possible to set boundaries and warn him off. Meanwhile, his friend Tom was discreetly looking into Eric's background, hoping to uncover anything that might help. But the waiting and the unknown only made the tension more unbearable for Joe and Linda. One night, just as they were settling down for a quiet evening, Joe's phone buzzed with a message from Tom. The message was brief. "Asterisk, we need to talk. It's important. Asterisk." Joe felt his stomach drop. He glanced at Linda, who had noticed his reaction. She looked concerned but waited for him to speak. "It's from Tom," Joe said. "He found something about Eric. I'm going to meet him. Shouldn't be long." Linda nodded, her face etched with worry. "Be careful, Joe, and let me know what he says." Joe gave her a reassuring hug and headed out to meet Tom at the usual spot, a small, quiet bar a few blocks from their home. When Joe arrived, Tom was already there, his expression serious. He motioned for Joe to join him in a booth at the back. "What did you find?" Joe asked, skipping any small talk. Tom leaned forward, his voice low. "I did some digging, and there's something you need to know. Eric Norton isn't just a high-ranking executive. He's connected to some pretty shady people in the business world. You might say he's involved in some under-the-table dealings." Joe's eyes narrowed. What kind of dealings? Tom glanced around, as if to make sure no one could overhear. Money laundering, insider trading, and let's just say he has a reputation for making his problems disappear. He met Joe's gaze with a hard look. The kind of people Eric associates with. They don't play by the same rules. If he feels like you're a threat to him, he's not going to just let it go. A cold chill settled over Joe. So you're saying he might try to hurt us? Tom nodded solemnly. I wouldn't rule it out. Men like him don't take kindly to interference, especially not from people outside their circle. I'd suggest laying low and maybe even considering a move, at least until things cool down. Joe clenched his jaw, thinking of Linda and the life they'd built in New Orleans. Moving away wasn't something they wanted, and it would mean starting from scratch. But the thought of Eric escalating his threats terrified him even more. Thanks for letting me know, Tom, Joe said quietly, feeling the weight of this new information settle heavily on his shoulders. Tom gave him a firm nod. Stay vigilant, Joe, and if anything feels off, anything at all, call me. They shook hands and Joe left the bar, feeling as though a dark cloud had settled over him. He walked home slowly, his mind racing. He needed to tell Linda, but he didn't want to worry her unnecessarily. Yet the thought of keeping something so important from her didn't sit right. When he returned home, Linda was waiting, her face full of concern. She approached him as he entered, searching his face for answers. What did Tom say? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Joe took a deep breath, deciding to be honest with her. He said Eric's not just a regular businessman. He's involved in some dangerous activities. He might see us as a threat. Linda's face went pale. She hugged herself as if to ward off the sudden chill she felt. So, what do we do? Are we safe? Joe wrapped his arms around her, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. We'll be okay, Linda. We just have to be careful and stay alert. I won't let anything happen to you. They spent the rest of the night talking through their options. Moving wasn't out of the question, but both Joe and Linda knew it was a decision they couldn't make lightly. For now, they would take every precaution and consider their options carefully. The next week went by quietly. Joe made sure to vary his routine, checking his surroundings whenever he went to or from work, and encouraged Linda to do the same. Despite the precautions, an underlying tension persisted. They were trying to live their lives as normally as possible, but the fear of what Eric might do was ever present. Then one evening, just as they were finishing dinner, the doorbell rang. Joe and Linda exchanged a glance, both of them tense. They weren't expecting anyone. I'll get it, Joe said, standing up and making his way to the door. He opened it to find a delivery man standing on their doorstep with a small, neatly wrapped package. Delivery for Joe Anderson? The man asked, handing over the package. Joe nodded, sighing for it and taking the box inside. As he closed the door, Linda came over looking curious. What's that? She asked. No idea, Joe replied, examining the package. It was wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. He set it on the kitchen counter and carefully opened it, revealing a small black box. Inside the box, on a bed of black velvet, lay a single bullet and a note. Joe picked up the note, his hands shaking as he read the message. Asterisk, stay out of my business. Asterisk. Joe's blood ran cold. He showed the note and the bullet to Linda, who gasped, covering her mouth in shock. Oh my God, Joe, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He's threatening us. Joe clenched his fists, his mind racing. Eric was making it clear that this wasn't over. This was a warning, a reminder of the power he held, and a promise of what could come if they didn't back down. We need to call Tom, Joe said, reaching for his phone. He needs to know about this. Within the hour, Tom was at their house, examining the package with a grim expression. This is serious, Joe. He's crossing a line. A threat like this, it's not something we can ignore. Joe nodded, feeling a mixture of anger and fear. What should we do? Can we report this? Tom sighed, scratching his chin. We can file a report, but without more concrete evidence, the police might not be able to do much. This is subtle enough that he could claim it's just a misunderstanding. People like Eric are careful. They know how to push boundaries without getting caught. Joe glanced at Linda, who was still visibly shaken. There has to be something we can do. We can't just sit here waiting for him to make another move. Tom nodded. We'll figure something out. I'll talk to a few people in the department, see if there's any way we can get him on record. In the meantime, make sure you both stay alert. If anything else happens, call me immediately. After Tom left, Joe and Linda spent the rest of the night in a tense silence, their minds reeling. The threat had become terrifyingly real, and the fear that Eric might act on his words hung over them like a storm cloud. The next morning, Joe felt a renewed sense of urgency. He couldn't let Eric's threats dictate their lives. With Linda's safety at the forefront of his mind, he began looking into private security options, researching companies that could provide protection around the clock. He even considered installing a security system at home, one with cameras and motion sensors to help them feel more secure. Linda, though grateful for Joe's efforts, remained anxious. Every sound made her jump, and she kept glancing at her phone, as if expecting another message from Eric. Joe noticed the strain it was putting on her, and he couldn't bear to see her live in fear. Linda, he said gently one evening as they sat together on the couch, we'll get through this. I'm not going to let him control our lives. We're stronger than he is. Linda nodded, managing a small smile. I know, Joe, but he's gotten under my skin. I can't help but wonder what he'll do next. Joe squeezed her hand, feeling a surge of protectiveness. Let him try. We're not backing down. But as determined as he was to stand his ground, Joe knew that their lives had changed in ways they couldn't ignore. Eric had made sure of that, and until they found a way to put an end to his threats, he and Linda would have to navigate each day with a sense of cautious vigilance, always watching, always waiting for the next move. The days that followed were a blur of fear and tension. Joe and Linda's once peaceful home now felt like a fortress under siege, as though Eric's presence lingered in every shadow, every unexpected sound. The security system Joe had installed was activated every night, and Linda had started carrying a small canister of pepper spray, just in case. Despite all the precautions, the feeling of vulnerability was impossible to shake. One evening, as they sat in the living room trying to watch a movie, Linda's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen, and her face went pale. It's him, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Joe's heart raced as he grabbed the phone from her hand. The message was short but chilling. Asterisk, you can't hide from me. Asterisk, Joe clenched his fists, feeling anger flare up within him. That's it, he said, his voice a low growl. This has to end now. I'm not letting him get away with this. Linda grabbed his arm, fear evident in her eyes. Joe, please don't do anything reckless. We don't know what he's capable of. Joe took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I know, Linda, but we can't live like this anymore. I'll talk to Tom. Maybe he has an idea. The next morning, Joe called Tom and set up a meeting. He couldn't bear to tell Linda, but he knew he had to get more aggressive about dealing with Eric. They couldn't afford to let their lives be dictated by his threats any longer. When Joe met Tom later that day, he found his friend waiting in a secluded corner of a diner, his face grim. Joe filled him in on the latest message, and Tom listened intently, nodding as Joe explained. This guy's getting bolder, Tom said, his jaw tight with frustration. It's like he's daring you to confront him, testing just how far he can push. Joe leaned forward, lowering his voice. I don't care what it takes, Tom. I just want him out of our lives. Is there anything we can do to stop him? Tom sighed, rubbing a hand across his forehead. The problem is, he's playing this smart. Everything he's done so far is vague enough that he could claim innocence if he tried to press charges. But he paused, considering his words carefully. If we could get him to say something incriminating, something concrete that would hold up in court, that would change things. Joe's mind raced, piecing together what Tom was suggesting. So you're saying we need proof, something undeniable. Tom nodded. Exactly. If he makes a clear threat or confesses to anything illegal, then we've got him. But we'd have to set up a situation where he thinks he has the upper hand, where he feels comfortable enough to slip up. Joe knew it was risky. Eric was a man who thrived on power, a man who had built a life around control and manipulation. But Joe was ready. If there was any chance to get him to admit his intentions, he would take it. "All right," Joe said, determination hardening his voice. "Tell me what I need to do." The plan was set into motion a few days later. Joe invited Eric to meet him at a quiet bar just outside the city, telling him over the phone that he wanted to discuss terms and put everything behind them. Eric agreed, sounding both intrigued and pleased, and Joe could practically hear the smug satisfaction in his voice. Linda was hesitant about the plan, but she knew they had few options left. She helped Joe prepare, going over every detail to make sure he stayed safe. By the time the evening arrived, Joe felt a mixture of fear and determination. He was ready to face Eric once and for all. When Joe arrived at the bar, Eric was already there, seated in a dimly lit corner booth with a drink in hand. He looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips as Joe approached. "Joe," Eric said, his tone dripping with mock friendliness. "I didn't think you'd be the one to reach out. I'm glad you're finally seeing reason." Joe sat down across from him, keeping his expression neutral. "I thought it was time we talked face to face. No more games," he replied, his voice steady. "There's no need to drag this on any longer." Eric took a slow sip of his drink, eyeing Joe over the rim of his glass. "Good. I like a man who knows when he's beaten. So what do you propose?" Joe leaned in slightly, his voice low. "Simple. You leave us alone, completely. You stay away from my family, from Linda. You go back to your life, and we go back to ours." Eric chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, Joe, you still don't understand, do you? You're in no position to make demands." His voice dropped, and a chilling look crossed his face. "I could have you both out of this town in a week. I could make sure you never work in this industry again. All it would take is one call." Joe felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his composure. "Is that really what you want, Eric? To destroy people who've done nothing to you? Is that what you're all about?" Eric smiled, as if amused. "I take what I want, Joe. It's how I got where I am. And your wife, she's a charming woman. The kind who deserves more than this small life you're trying to build." Joe clenched his fists under the table, anger simmering just below the surface. But he needed Eric to keep talking to reveal his true intentions. "And if I don't let you have what you want?" he asked, his tone challenging. Eric leaned in closer, his voice a dark whisper. "Then I'll take it anyway. You think you can stop me? Men like you are a dime a dozen, Joe. You're disposable." At that moment, Joe glanced at his phone, subtly checking the recording app Tom had set up. It was still running, catching every word. The evidence he needed was piling up with every arrogant remark Eric made. "Let me make myself clear," Joe said, his voice steely. "If you so much as come near Linda again, I'll make sure you regret it." Eric laughed softly, unfazed. "Oh, Joe, you don't scare me. But you know what? I admire your spirit. Shame it won't save you." Joe stood up, trying to hold back the rage boiling inside him. "Goodbye, Eric. This is the last time you'll ever hear from me." He turned and walked out, resisting the urge to look back. He knew he had enough evidence now. Eric had practically confessed to everything. Back at home, Joe met with Tom, who had been waiting to help him upload the recording. The two of them listened through the recording, nodding as Eric's threats and admissions played out clearly. "This is it," Tom said, grinning. "This is enough to get him out of your life for good." Within the next week, Tom passed the recording on to the authorities. Eric was summoned for questioning, his high-profile position making it impossible for him to dodge the scrutiny. News of his shady dealings and threats began to spread, tarnishing his reputation and isolating him from his powerful connections. Joe and Linda watched the developments from the safety of their home, feeling a sense of relief for the first time in months. The weight of Eric's threats lifted, and they were finally able to relax, knowing they had reclaimed their lives. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Joe took Linda's hand, feeling a renewed sense of peace. "It's over," he said softly, smiling at her. "We did it. He's out of our lives." Linda smiled back, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Thank you, Joe, for protecting us, for standing by me through everything. I don't know how I would have done it without you." Joe wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "We did it together. No matter what happens, I'll always protect you." They sat there in silence as the sun set, feeling a new strength in their bond, a bond that no one, not even a man like Eric, could break. Their future was theirs again, free from fear, and for the first time in a long time, they felt truly safe. As the weeks passed, Joe and Linda felt the grip of fear loosen and their lives return to a comforting normal. Eric's reputation had been tarnished beyond repair, and he was under investigation by authorities for the multiple offenses captured in Joe's recording. The story had quickly spread, drawing media attention that forced Eric into an unwanted spotlight. For Joe and Linda, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one they hoped would finally be free from shadows. One Friday night, Joe and Linda decided to celebrate their newfound peace with a quiet dinner out. They picked a cozy Italian restaurant near their neighborhood, the kind of place they used to frequent when they first moved to New Orleans. As they settled into a booth by the window, a warm feeling washed over them both. The dim glow of candlelight reflected in Linda's eyes, and Joe found himself smiling, the weight of the past months feeling like a distant memory. "It's so good to be out again," Linda said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Thank you, Joe, for everything. I know this hasn't been easy." Joe squeezed her hand, his voice soft. "We made it through because we stood together. I would do it all over again if it meant keeping you safe." They clinked their wine glasses and shared stories, laughing and reminiscing. The fear that had held them captive seemed to melt away with every sip, every shared glance. They were beginning to feel like themselves again, finding joy in the little moments that had once been overshadowed by Eric's threats. Halfway through their meal, Joe's phone buzzed with a text message. Thinking it might be a work email, he glanced at the screen, but the sender made his heart skip a beat. The message was from a number he didn't recognize, but the content was unmistakable. Asterisk, enjoy your freedom while it lasts. It's never over. Asterisk. Joe felt a chill creep over him. He looked up at Linda, who noticed his change in expression instantly. "What is it?" she asked, her tone filled with concern. Joe hesitated, not wanting to shatter the peaceful evening they had longed for. But he knew he couldn't hide the truth from her. He turned the phone toward her so she could see the message. Linda's face fell as she read it, her eyes widening with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Joe," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Does this mean?" Joe's jaw tightened, and he quickly stood up. "I'll take care of it," he assured her, his tone steady. "We're not letting him scare us again." He called Tom immediately, stepping outside the restaurant so he wouldn't worry Linda any further. Tom answered on the second ring, and Joe quickly explained the message. "It's in Tom. Somehow he still has a way to contact us." Tom let out a sigh. "Listen, Joe, people like him don't give up easily. But with the case against him building, he's running out of options. This could be his last attempt to intimidate you." Joe felt his anger simmer, recalling all the torment Eric had put them through. "What do you suggest?" "We'll track the number," Tom replied. "In the meantime, keep a record of any messages or attempts he makes to reach out. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case will be." Joe thanked Tom and returned to the table, doing his best to put on a calm face for Linda's sake. She could tell he was holding something back, but she reached across the table to squeeze his hand, offering him a reassuring smile. "We'll get through this, Joe. We're stronger than him, remember." Joe nodded, comforted by her strength. They finished their meal, clinging to the normalcy of the evening, determined not to let Eric's lingering shadow ruin their night. Over the next few days, Joe and Linda stayed vigilant, wary of any signs that Eric might be lurking nearby. But as Tom had predicted, the messages ceased, and they heard nothing more from Eric. Slowly, they dared to hope that perhaps he had made his last attempt. One afternoon, Joe received a call from Tom, who had an update on the case. Joe, I have good news, Tom said, his tone laced with relief. The authorities have officially moved forward with charges against Eric. Thanks to your recording and the other evidence we gathered, he'll likely face a trial soon, and with any luck, he'll be out of your life for good. Joe let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That's incredible news, Tom. I can't thank you enough. It's the least I could do, Tom replied. You've been through a lot. Now it's time to start fresh. Joe shared the news with Linda, who broke into a relieved smile, tears welling up in her eyes. For the first time since Eric had come into their lives, they felt like they could finally breathe easy. The weeks that followed brought a sense of closure, as though they were waking up from a long nightmare. Joe and Linda refocused on their work, their friendships, and the plans they'd put on hold during the months of turmoil. They redecorated their home, painting over memories of tension with bright, warm colors. Every evening they spent time together, savoring the peace they had fought so hard to win. One evening, as they sat together on their porch watching the sunset, Linda leaned her head on Joe's shoulder, her voice soft. Do you think he'll ever really be gone? Joe put his arm around her, feeling the strength of their bond in that moment. I do, he said, his voice confident. No matter what happens, he doesn't have power over us anymore. We've taken back our lives, and nothing can take that away. Linda looked up at him, her eyes filled with trust and love. Thank you, Joe, for standing by me for everything. I don't know how I could have done it without you. Joe kissed her forehead, holding her close. We did it together, Linda, and we're stronger because of it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over their home, Joe and Linda felt a renewed sense of hope for the future. They knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side, their trust in each other stronger than ever. In the months that followed, they finally felt free.